Hey everyone! So before I get into this lecture video for evidence, I would like you to first read that argument chapter if you haven't, right? And the reason for that is that this lecture will make a lot more sense if you read that argument chapter and um, answer the discussion forum posts. So when you read that chapter, you probably already know this, but they go over very briefly the different types of evidence you can use to support your argument. And evidence is really important as we go into this argumentative essay. So in that chapter, they talked about like statistics, data, expert testimony, but here I'll go a little bit more in depth, right, with the types of evidence you can use for this upcoming argumentative essay. So why do you need evidence? Well, a strong essay needs a clear argument. We know that already, right? You need some kind of guiding opinion or stance. We call this the thesis statement. But arguments alone are not enough. You have to support them with evidence. So think of it this way: you can tell your readers anything you want, but if you don't show them or back it up, then they're not very convinced and they won't really listen to what you have to say or they won't believe you, right? It's the same thing. Think about it in your own life when you are browsing through social media feeds or anything like that. Do you just believe what everyone's telling you? I hope not, right? Especially if they don't have any evidence to back up what they're saying, right? So that's why evidence is so important. So think of your claim as a house, right? This house you're trying to build up, and evidence is that foundation to build that house. Without the foundation, that house is going to come crashing down. So, what's a claim? A claim is a statement that can be proven or disproven with evidence. So, it often takes a stance. So, when you say something is true, not true, something's right, something's wrong, or helpful, harmful, etc. So, basically, when we say claim, it's almost the same thing as argument, thesis statement. You'll hear people use them sort of interchangeably because they kind of mean the same thing. A claim is an argument, right? A claim is a thesis statement. So, when I use the word claim, it's like you're just telling, right? And that's the same thing with your thesis or argument. You're telling your reader things, and then now you got to show them, right? So here are some examples of claims. So the first one: unifying the Mariana Islands chain will strengthen economic development for all island nations. This is a claim. It is not a fact, right? This is a thesis statement. So this has to be proven. This could be proven to be true. This could be proven to be false. We don't know, but we need evidence, right, to prove it. Or you could even claim that the US prison system unfairly targets Black Americans. This is a claim. We need to support it, right? So again, a claim is not a fact, right? A claim is pretty much your thesis statement. So going back to show and tell, and you'll already have noticed by now that, I mention it quite a lot, right? Because in academic writing, it's all about showing your strategies, narration, description, example, compare and contrast, etc. Those are ways for you to show your ideas rather than simply telling your reader, right? So evidence is the showing and show and tell, just like the strategies. So telling is when you just tell your reader things, right? You make a claim without giving evidence, but showing is when you actually back that up with evidence, an example, details, etc. So in academic writing, you need both, right? One can't work without the other. So this is my favorite analogy to give. So when you were in kindergarten, you most likely did a show and tell, right? You had to bring an object from home and you talked about it in front of your class, right? I know I did it, but I don't remember what I brought, right? But so let's pretend I have a show and tell and I'm very excited. I want to show off my pet fish. His name's Frank, let's just say, and he can do a cool trick. Maybe I can make him like spin around in the water, right? And I want to show him off to my classmates. So I want to bring him to my show and tell. And I'm so excited for a day and I get on the bus, but I realize I forgot to bring Frank. So when I get to school and I'm standing in front of my classmates, and I can tell my classmates everything, like, yeah, I have this pet fish named Frank and he can do this amazing trick. But because I can't show it, right, they don't believe me. They're like, no, Christina, you're exaggerating or you're lying, right? So now let's rewind. Okay, now let's pretend I did bring Frank on that bus. Okay, and and I have him in my hands and I'm gonna stand in front of my classmates and I have the fish tank in my hands. But I get too nervous to speak and I don't tell anything. So therefore they never get to see the cool trick he can do. They never get to learn about him. So in that way, you need both. You need the showing, you need the telling. One can't work without the other. So remember, if you only have claims in your essay, you're simply telling instead of showing. Right? Going back all the way to the narrative essay, right? If you did get feedback from me where I was like, you need more concrete details, you need more narrative details, you need more showing, right? Because that's kind of what it is. You're telling your reader about certain events that happen, but unless you go into detail and you provide some description or details about it, you're just telling us, right? So you need both. But for sure, your telling should never overpower your showing. You should always have more showing than your telling. So, why does evidence matter so much? Because if you only tell, your argument lacks credibility, right? The reader's not really willing to believe in you, right? They're not willing to be convinced because the evidence is going to prove what you're trying to tell them. The stronger your evidence, the stronger the argument in your essay. So evidence can look like a lot of different things, right? It's your real world examples or your personal experience, observations you make, any statistics or data, right? Quotations or information you get from research, expert testimony, anecdotes you get from other people, right? Or your personal anecdotes, and of course, descriptions. For this argumentative essay, the use of sources is optional, right? And you can just use strategies like narration, example, but if you want to use source information, you can. So before you begin researching, right, for your paper or in any other class, right, when you think about the type of evidence you want to use, you want to choose the right kind. So I would really think about the purpose and the context that you're writing in, right? So there's different factors that can almost control or dictate what type of evidence you may actually need or that you can actually use. So first think about your instructor, right? Because ultimately the instructor is the one, right, who is grading the paper. So think about what type of evidence they're looking for, right? In my class, I think personal experience and personal observation can totally be used as evidence, but I've met many instructors and professors in different fields, right, who don't believe that personal experience is valid as evidence, right? So think about who the instructor is. Okay, and then second, think about the academic field or discipline that you're in. So let's say you're writing for a humanities course like philosophy or something, or an English course like this, right? More than likely, personal experience or observation would be totally fine to use. But when we get to the sciences, right, the sciences is more data driven. So they're looking at numbers, right? So you might want to use more numbers based evidence. And then think about the assignment, think about the paper that you're writing. If your instructor tells you they want a research paper, right, then they're going to be looking for you to use mostly maybe source information, right? And furthermore, for this argumentative essay, right, in this class, because I'm asking you to choose your topic based on the field or discipline you're in, that's going to play a factor in that. So let's say you are in hospitality, right, and you want to argue that tourism on Guam, right? We need more tourism on Guam. Maybe that's your argument. Okay. So maybe you're going to have a lot of numbers based data because you're going to need statistics on how many tourists have been coming in. You might need to compare between years, right? Between certain demographics of tourism. You might need the numbers on how much they're spending, right? So then most of your evidence might just be numbers based. Okay. And then think about your audience. What kind of evidence do you think your audience needs to be convinced, right, by your argument? Right? Do they need, maybe they might really want a lot of numbers based data, but then adding personal experience could really, right, really convince the reader to take your side. So think about your audience always, right? And keep in mind that certain arguments, they might require different types of evidence or only one type. Sometimes numbers based data is, that's it, you only need statistics, right? So those are just different factors to keep in mind, right? Because you're not just writing for this class, you're going to be going into other classes and writing for different instructors, different fields. So, right, these are just things to keep in mind, to be very cognizant, right, of the context that you're writing in. So before I go into the different types of evidence, I kind of want to just briefly touch on primary versus secondary sources. So there's two types of sources, right? The first kind is primary. Primary just means that these sources are original first-hand accounts of information, right? So it's like an original account of something. So like let's say you go to a fiesta and you observe all these things, that is you are a primary source because you were there, your first-hand account, right, of that fiesta, that's a primary source. It's originally from you, right? And sometimes these primary sources could be interviews. You go out and you directly interview someone. That's a primary source. Speeches, any observations you make. If you do your own survey, let's say like you do a Google quiz survey or you do like an Instagram poll and you gather data from that, that is a primary source, right? Or even your personal experiences, because again, that is your firsthand account of something. So, some specific examples of primary sources, you go and conduct an interview with a local fisherman. Maybe you're going to write an argumentative essay about how Guam needs to regulate fishing more, right? Or maybe you include your personal narrative, right? You use narration strategy, you use a personal narrative on the difficulties of being an immigrant. You have original artwork that you drew, right? Depicting maybe plant species on Guam. Or there's a scholarly journal article, right? A researcher went out and did their own research, right? And published a journal article on Guam's children's literacy levels. Or you make a personal observation about something. Or an autobiography, right? Those are all primary sources. Secondary sources, they just think of them as sources that talk about primary sources. So whenever a source interprets another source, or they analyze another source, or they describe another source, or they comment on it, when they talk about a primary source, then it becomes a secondary source. So common secondary sources are textbooks, books and articles that interpret research or they review research, any histories or biographies, reviews of something, literary interpretations of something. Those are secondary sources because they're talking about original first-hand accounts, right, or primary sources. Here are some specific examples of secondary sources. Let's say you write a movie review on Moana. That is, you're talking about a primary source, then your review becomes secondary. A literary analysis on something, or maybe you critique someone's artwork, right? That's secondary. Or an anthology or collection of essays about something, right? Then that the anthology, that collection of essays becomes secondary sources. A biography of someone or a journal article that talks about someone else's research, right? Then that's a secondary source. And of course, our textbook is a secondary source, right? And why is that? Um, all textbooks sort of are secondary sources. Most of them are because what they do is they take ideas and research and theories from other people and they put it together and they talk about it, right? So our textbook, the author Thomas Cooley, these ideas originally aren't his own, right? Like things like using example, narration, description, but those are theories or ideas from other people and he talks about them, right? He collects it together and he talks about them. So textbook is a secondary source. So what types of evidence are there? The first kind is quantitative data. Okay, so when you look at the base word there, it's quantity, right? So numbers. So any kind of numbers-based data, numerical data. Statistics from studies, you go and do a survey. Maybe you go to I've had students go to their community gym, right? Or like the Yanni Heights gym, and they went and they polled a bunch of people and asked them questions, right? So any numbers you get from that, like you could have found out that, oh, 4 out of 10 people say they don't get enough exercise, right? So that's quantitative data. You do a poll. You can even do like an Instagram poll. I believe you can do polls on WhatsApp too, right? So, or like let's say you do an experiment, right? And you time how long it takes for a plant to grow under certain conditions, and you compare those times, right? That time is the quantitative data. So anything that's measurable, you use quantitative data when you want to show a trend, a pattern, or you're trying to make a comparison. So here are two examples of quantitative data. So the first one, in 2023, A housing survey by the Guam Housing and Urban Renewal Authority, 78% of Guam residents reported that rent was their biggest financial burden. So here we're trying to, this number is significant because we're trying to show a trend that this huge number of, and 78% is a lot. So 78% of people, right, show a trend that they believe rent is the biggest financial burden. Or here's a second one. In a poll I conducted on college students' attitudes toward reading, 15 out of 20 students reported that the only reading they have done in the past year were readings that were required for their classes, right? So here I'm trying to show a trend that 15 out of 20, that's a pretty large number, right, of students who don't read except for what's required of them in a course. The opposite of quantitative data is qualitative data. So, data that's not based on numbers. So, this can include your personal narratives or experiences, so narration, right? Interviews you go out and you directly conduct with other people, maybe a classmate, maybe instructor, right? Or some other expert, or a personal observation that you make. And this can include any details or descriptions, right? Or sometimes even dialogue, what people say, that could be considered qualitative data. Or you witness a certain action or behavior and you describe it, that's qualitative data. So you use qualitative data when you want to add personal insight, right? And qualitative data works really well when you balance it with other types of evidence, right? Because it can add a human perspective, and most importantly, it could add emotional appeal, right? Which you should have read about in the argument chapter. And here are some examples of qualitative data. Let's say you go out and maybe you make a personal observation on Guam's increasing rate of the homeless population. Maybe you include an observation you made about how there's a certain area you drive past every day and you've noticed more and more people, right, have been camping out there, right? Or maybe you include a personal narrative about how difficult it's been for you to find an affordable place to live, to show that, right, rent is a huge concern, right? Rent is a huge financial burden for people. Or maybe you do a personal interview. So you could say, in a personal interview, local resident Jane Cruz said, "I've never seen prices rise so fast. I've had to take on 2 jobs." So here you have a little bit of, I guess you call it dialogue, right? Where you interview someone. And third, you have examples. I'm not going to talk too deeply about this because we already talked about examples so much, right? It's its own strategy, right? We talked about how fundamental examples are, right, in even our everyday life. So, again, examples are just concrete instances that you use to support your point. So, use this when you want to illustrate a claim or you want to show real life relevance. So, real life relevance in terms of like you find real world examples, right? So, here's an example here. After Guam's minimum wage increased to $9.25 in 2020, Guam Cafe reported cutting back employee shifts from 40 hours to 30 hours per week to offset rising payroll costs. So here, this is just made up. There's no Guam Cafe, right? But this is a way you can use an example that's concrete and specific, right? To maybe to if you're going to argue that increasing minimum wage may not necessarily be the best thing for the economy. And number four is hypotheticals. So you can use hypotheticals to not necessarily as evidence, but it's a great way to help the reader imagine something, right? So to imagine a situation that could demonstrate a possible outcome. So if, like, for example, if A were to happen with B, then maybe C could happen, right? So just giving them maybe that scenario, right? But use this carefully. This is something I would avoid overusing, and I would make sure it's logical and believable. The only reason that I say to use it sparingly is because hypothetical is just a hypothetical, right? It's not a real situation. It's not something that's already happened. So if you were to build your entire argument on, well, if A happened, then B, then C, then D, then E could happen, then you've just literally built your house on basically a house of cards, and it's easy to come crashing down, right? So just use this one sparingly. So here's an example of a hypothetical. If Guam had a government funded after school program, working parents could better manage their time and income, right? So again, if A were to happen, right, then maybe B could happen, right? So that's just a hypothetical. And lastly, you can use sources. And most sources are research based, they have research based evidence. especially if you find a scholarly article. So, why are scholarly articles so widely used in research papers? Because in order to get published in an academic journal, your paper, your research had to have gone in front of a panel of people who are also experts in that field, and they had to have peer reviewed it, right? So that's why scholarly articles are usually considered great sources to use. But sources could include, right, expert testimony from other people, right, quotes, paraphrases, or summaries, right, from articles or whatever research based evidence you can find. So use this when you need credible, expert-backed information. So here's an example. According to a 2024 study from the University of Hawaii, Chamorro language instruction increases cultural identity in teens. So this is an example of how you can maybe use a summary based, right? You summarize a source. I think the most important thing when you're using evidence, especially evidence that it comes from a source, right? Is think about whether or not that evidence directly supports your thesis. It has to support it, right? And sometimes people include evidence that actually contradicts what they were trying to argue, right? But they thought that it was supporting it. So whenever, especially if you're using source information, I would be really careful to make sure that I understand what that source is actually trying to say, right? So ask yourself, does this prove the point I'm trying to make? If not, revise it or remove it. Okay, so let's look at this example. Let's pretend our thesis statement for our paper is college students on Guam face food insecurity, which affects their academic success. So here's an example of evidence I have. According to a survey I conducted on the Guam Community College campus, 20 out of 24 students reported that they felt overwhelmed by their responsibilities. And I'm sure in the writer's mind, this might seem like relevant to the thesis, right? Maybe it's kind of related, right? Because it deals with academic success. But remember, based on our thesis, we're only trying to prove that food insecurity, right? Not having access to food, right, affects academic success. But this evidence doesn't directly support that thesis. So in this case, right, this is not a good piece of evidence to use. So when we think about the criteria, right, of evidence, or when we look at the criteria we apply to whether or not we should use a certain piece of evidence, think about whether or not it's significant or insignificant. So not all evidence is equally strong, right? Try to avoid evidence that one relies on too few people. So for example, 2 out of 10 students said blah blah blah. 10 is not necessarily a significant number, and then furthermore on top of that, 2 out of 10, right? 2 out of 10 is not really, may not make a strong case for you, right? So this relies on too few people. The next thing is I would avoid evidence that lacks context or is based on outliers. So what do I mean by that? You don't want to find the most special, unique case of something and be like, yeah, that proves my point, right? So what's a good example? You, let's say you just have an argument that not everyone needs to go to college to be successful. Let's just say, right? So then you talk about Bill Gates. But Bill Gates is such an outlier. He's such a special case that it's you can't really use him as evidence, right? Because that is such a very unique case. So don't rely on the outliers, right? Choose the average, right? And then avoid evidence that feels dramatic. Like it feels like, wow, very important, but it's not relevant to what you're trying to argue. Right, so here I have some other examples. The first one, I asked 2 classmates, and only one said they could afford lunch. So out of 2 people you asked, only one said they could actually afford lunch. So this is not really like a significant piece of evidence, right? I would go out and ask more people, maybe, right? But let's say you do an online survey of 40 college students, and then 72% reported skipping meals to save money. This is significant because 40 is quite a large number, and 72% of them have said this thing, then that's a pretty significant piece of evidence. I would use this. So here's some tips for using evidence well. Always introduce it, right? Set up your quote or data, right? If you did a personal interview, set it up. Say, I did a personal interview with student Maria Cruz, right? And she said blah, blah, blah. Or I did a personal interview with instructor Joe Cruz, right? who is a master mechanic, and he said this blah blah blah, right? So I would introduce it. Then after you give that evidence, explain it. Don't assume the reader knows how it supports your claim, and connect it. Always tie it back to your thesis or main point. So when we get to analysis and idea unit construction, right, in the next week, I'll talk more deeply about how to explain your evidence and how to connect it back to your thesis statement. And I'll also have slides on how to use source information, how to properly integrate sources into your paper if you choose to use sources. Again, that's optional, right, for the argumentative essay. So final reminder, strong essay needs a strong argument and a strong support. So have a thesis statement you can actually back up and support it, right? Use specific, credible, relevant evidence. Make sure your evidence always supports your thesis. It should always match up. And don't rely too heavily on one kind of support. Right? You don't want to do all qualitative data, like just all personal experience. Maybe balance it out with some examples, right? So mix it up.